Heartbreak in South LA after gunshots ring out in broad daylight.
6 at one time, 6 again, 6 again. I mean, it was a gang of shots.
More breaking news here. Another shooting, this one in South LA.
The parking lot of this AutoZone, that's where the shooting took place. LAPD says that someone came along and shot the victim in this car right here. Looks like a newer BMW. And the victim was shot multiple times, transported to the hospital now in unknown condition. And the suspect got away, fled in a black sedan.
Deadly shooting in South Los Angeles. It happened at 88th Street and Vermont in South LA.
4 people were shot, one of them killed near the intersection of 88th Street and Vermont around 12:30 this afternoon.
In today's video, we're going to be talking about a situation that would happen between the Rollin Hunnits, the Hoovers, and the 8 Trey gangsters, to where a few people would be murdered. But let's dive into it. We're going to start off with a murder on March 12th of 2015. And on this day, somebody named Cleveland Ross would be murdered at AutoZone. Cleveland Ross was 27 at the time of his murder, and the shooting happened at about 4:45 at night. And the shooting happened on the corner of Century Boulevard and Hoover Street, which would be an AutoZone right there on the corner. Detectives would collect surveillance footage, and they would see that the shooter jumped out of a red Buick, and it was possibly a LeSabre model. But luckily for the shooters, the quality of the camera wasn't good enough to pick up the license plate. However, there was a few witnesses inside of the AutoZone that would see the shooting, and one of them would be somebody named Derek Jones, and he would describe the shooter as somebody that was bald and brown-skinned. And there was also a married couple that witnessed the shooting, and they would tell detectives that the shooter had a Clint Eastwood-style gun, meaning a revolver. And they would describe the shooter as somebody that was dark, about 40 years old, he was bald, and he had round glasses. And with the description these witnesses gave, police would have an idea of who they think it may be, and they would do a photo lineup, and they would put somebody from the Rollin Hunnits in it, and that person would be somebody named Tiny Fly. And as you can see in this picture right here, he would fit the description. However, the married couple was not able to identify him in the photo lineup, and they would show that photo lineup to the other witness, whose name was Derek Jones, and he was also not able to identify him in the photo lineup. And even though police had an idea of where to look, some time would go by, and there would still be no arrest made. And then just 3 months later, on June 10th of 2015, another shooting would happen, but this one would take place in the 8 Trey gangster territory. And in this shooting, 5 people were shot outside of a liquor store on 88th Street and Vermont Avenue. But unfortunately for the victims, one of them would pass away, and that person would be Michael Washington. And the other 4 that were shot would be Michael Baptiste, Laurel Williams, Kevin Carr, and somebody named Lisa Jack. However, after the shooting, Baptiste would tell detectives that he saw a car drive by with 3 men who were not from that area. He would then tell detectives that when he seen them drive by, he would tell Washington that they needed to leave, and when he said that, he would hear shots ring out. He would then tell detectives that after the shots rang out, he would attempt to reverse his vehicle, but a white Chevy Malibu and another vehicle would sandwich him in and block him in. Baptiste would be shot in the leg during the shooting, and then the Chevy Malibu would drive away, and Kevin Carr, who was also in the vehicle, would get out of the vehicle and run. Baptiste then told detectives that after the shooting, he would look for Michael Washington across the street, and that's when he would spot him staggering. And Lisa Jack just happened to be sitting outside reading a book when she was shot in the hip by a stray bullet. And the last person to be shot would be Kevin Carr, and like we said, he would jump out the vehicle and run. But Kevin Carr happened to be a member from the Hoovers, and he was also shot in the leg. And after Kevin Carr's surgery, the detectives would visit him in the hospital, and he would tell detectives that he saw somebody wearing a gold-rimmed glasses, dressed in a hoodie, and running towards him. And a city bus driver who just happened to be stopped at that corner at that time witnessed the whole shooting, and he would tell detectives that he heard gunfire and saw somebody wearing gold-framed glasses jump out of a vehicle and open fire on a brown vehicle. He would then say after that, the person wearing the gold-framed glasses jumped into the front passenger seat and the car took off. So now this would be the second murder in 3 months, to where witnesses are saying that the shooter had on glasses. And with that description and the ongoing beef in the area, they would assume that it was the Rollin Hunnits again, and they would show the bus driver a photo lineup containing Tiny Fly. And the bus driver would identify Tiny Fly as the shooter in the photo lineup. And a few months after the shooting, Kevin Carr, who was the member of the Hoover who was shot in his leg, would identify Tiny Fly in the photo lineup also. And in August of 2015, which would be just 2 months after the murder, detectives would obtain a search warrant for Tiny Fly's Facebook and more. Detectives also spoke with informants, and they would tell the detectives that they heard it on the streets that the Rollin Hunnits were responsible for both murders of Cleveland Ross and Michael Washington. And they would also tell detectives that they heard the shooter's name was Tiny Fly, or Fly. The informants would also give detectives a bunch of names of people that they knew that were present during the shooting, and one of them people happened to be somebody with the last name Jefferson. And Jefferson would be one of the first people arrested, and he would be charged with the murder, and at first he would deny involvement in the murder, but later on, he would end up speaking to police. He would tell detectives that he was at his girlfriend's house located in the Rollin Hunnits territory, and he would also tell detectives that while he was there, he was chilling with a few members of the Rollin Hunnits. And just so there's no confusion, I'm only going to name the ones that actually matter in the story. So he would tell detectives that he was chilling with somebody named Johnny Johnson, and he would also tell detectives that he was chilling with somebody named Tiny Fly, and he would also tell detectives that 2 other people were there with them. He would then say an additional car pulled up with other members of the Rollin Hunnits, and in the vehicle that just pulled up would be Infant Toon, aka Toonchi 5, and somebody named Baby Hound. And according to Jefferson, and this is all alleged, he would say that Infant Toon, aka Toonchi 5, and Baby Hound would pull up and say they spotted Cleveland Ross at that AutoZone nearby. And like we previously said, this AutoZone would be located in the heart of the 107 Hoovers. And again, this is all according to Jefferson. He would then tell detectives that when Toonchi 5 and them pulled up and said that, Tiny Fly would respond and ask them what they wanted to do about it. And according to Jefferson, he would say that Toonchi 5 and the other Rollin Hunnit members would respond and say, let's go over there. Jefferson would then tell detectives that they all got into 3 separate cars and headed to the AutoZone, and that they would use the car method. And that's when the front and the back car would protect the middle car, which is containing the shooters. And Jefferson would say that he was driving the car in the front, and it was him and Infant Toon, aka Toonchi 5. And he would say that behind them was a burgundy Buick, and inside of that vehicle was somebody named Demetrius and Tiny Fly, and that would be the shooter vehicle. And behind that vehicle would be Johnny Johnson, and he would be inside of a BMW. All 3 vehicles then arrived at the AutoZone, and they would circle the parking lot, and they would spot Cleveland Ross fixing his vehicle. All 3 vehicles would then park, and Jefferson would hop out of his vehicle and walk towards Johnny Johnson's BMW. Jefferson would then tell detectives that at this time, he would see Tiny Fly jumping out of the Buick, carrying a .357 revolver. That's when he would point at Cleveland Ross, and he would open fire. Jefferson then ran back to his vehicle, and all 3 vehicles would flee the scene. He would then tell detectives that all 3 vehicles met back up at his girlfriend's house. And a few hours later, they would pick up Johnny Johnson, and they would interrogate him. He would tell detectives that he was parked at the AutoZone during the shooting. He would tell detectives that he heard the shots, and he looked over, but he didn't know who was shooting, and he didn't recognize him. They would then show Johnson a picture of Tiny Fly, and Johnson would claim that he didn't know who Tiny Fly was, but later on in the interview, he would admit to knowing him. And he would also tell detectives that the vehicles involved was a red Buick, a silver Chrysler, and his BMW. And a few hours after these statements, they would pick up Tiny Fly and they would arrest him. And on September 22nd of 2016, all 3 of them would be charged and booked. And as you can see right here, even though it was 3 vehicles full of people, only 3 people would be charged for this murder. And 2 out of the 3 people are blaming the first person, who would be Tiny Fly. But all 3 would be charged with 1 count of murder, 1 count of conspiracy to commit any crime, and 1 count of felon in possession of a firearm. And don't forget, this would be for the murder of Cleveland Ross. And just 4 days later, while Tiny Fly was in custody, they would charge him with the murder of Michael Washington. They would charge him on September 26th of 2016, and they would also arrest 4 other people. And on this case, they would be charged with 1 count of murder, 1 count of conspiracy to commit any crime, 1 count of felon in possession of a firearm, 2 counts of attempted murder, 1 count of shooting at an inhabited dwelling, and another 2 counts of attempted murder. And one of the people that was charged in the murder would give a statement in exchange for a plea bargain. And his name was Patrick Bell, and he was the one that drove the white Malibu that sandwiched Baptiste's car. He would tell detectives that he was a member of the Rollin Hunnits, and he knew Tiny Fly because they were cousins through marriage, and they also went to school together. Detectives would then ask Bell about the shooting, and they would say that they had his license plate on video. Bell would then say that he had 10 brothers, and he claimed that multiple people always drove his vehicle. And at first, Bell told detectives that he didn't want to tell on anybody, but once he realized that somebody implicated him, he would change his mind. And like we said at first, Bell was charged with accessory to murder. Then he would decide to talk to police. He would then tell police that he was at the shooting and knew the shooter. Bell would then identify Tiny Fly as the shooter, and he would tell police that somebody named Ferge was driving and Marcus Bradnax was in the back seat. And the names that he gave up would be the other co-defendants on this case also. Tiny Fly and the Rollin Hunnits would then have to sit in the county jail for the next 4 years, but we're going to start off with the first case they would be sentenced for, which would be the murder of Cleveland Ross. And on January 9th of 2020, Jefferson, who would be the first person that gave a statement, would take a plea deal on this case, and he would have the murder reduced to a voluntary manslaughter, and they would give him 11 years in state prison. And 4 days later, on January 13th of 2020, Johnny Johnson would also take a plea deal, and he would have his murder reduced to a voluntary manslaughter. And don't forget that he also gave a statement, and he would also get 11 years in state prison. And 4 days later, on January 17th of 2020, Tiny Fly would have this case consolidated with the other case that he was fighting for the murder of Michael Williams from the 8-Trey Gangsters. And just 2 months after that, one of the co-defendants from this case would take a plea deal on March 3rd of 2020, and he would have every other count dismissed, but he would take a plea deal on 2 counts of attempted murder. And for count 1, they would give him 17 years. And for count 2, they would also give him 17 years, but he would be able to run them concurrent. And 3 days later, on March 6th of 2020, another co-defendant would take a plea deal on 2 counts of attempted murder, and he would have all the other counts dismissed. And on count 1, he would get 17 years also, and on count 2, 17 years again, but like the other co-defendant, he would be able to run them concurrent. Then a year later, on June 1st of 2021, the last co-defendant would take a plea deal, and he would have all the other counts dismissed, but he would take a plea deal on the murder, and they would give him 15 years to life, and the last person to be sentenced would be Tiny Fly. And on June 25th of 2021, Tiny Fly would be found guilty on every count except for 2 counts of conspiracy. And don't forget that they consolidated the other case to this one, so he would be found guilty of 2 murders and a bunch more. And for the attempted murder of Lisa Jack, they would give him 14 years based on a prior strike, and they would also give him 25 years to life for a gun enhancement, plus 10 years. So just on this count, it would be 49 years to life. They would then give him life without parole for counts 1, and they would give him life without parole again for count 9, plus an additional 30 years for enhancements. And on counts 3 and count 11, they would give him about 11 years, because as you can see in yellow, it says 28 months on each count, but then under it says doubled, plus 1 year gang enhancement. So if it was doubled, it would be 56 months on each count, plus the 1 year. And on counts 4, 7, and 8, they would sentence him to 3 terms of life imprisonment, plus an additional 30 years on each count for enhancements, so an additional 90 years on top of that. And the court would make every count besides count 5 and 6 to run consecutively. And if you're wondering about Bell, he would identify Tiny Fly at trial, and he would receive a relocation assistance, and they would give him approximately $17,000 to relocate. But that right there is going to wrap it up for the story, and I appreciate you guys for tuning in. Comment, like, and subscribe. It's Respectable Rants, and I appreciate y'all.